Hi, everybody. This is panel number 3 on day 3 of TBRCon2022. Very excited to be chatting with everyone that I have with me today. I'm your host, moderator, Adrian M. Gibson. I'm a reviewer for fanflyaddict.com and also the host of SFF Addicts, which is our in-house podcast. And today we're going to be talking about cinematic storytelling. And I'm going to go through and introduce every guest, but say something a little bit more about yourself when I call your name. So first off, we have Hugh Howey.
Hey guys, I'm Hugh. Wrote a couple of books that I guess were cinematic enough to get the adaptation treatment. So it's been fun to watch that come together and actually see the worlds getting built. And looking forward to hanging out with you guys and hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, me too. And next up, we have Brian Popery Naslund. How are you, buddy?
Oh, God. I'm Brian Popery Naslund. I'm a fantasy author. I wrote a series of adult fantasy with tour books called the Dragons of Terra series. It's got lots of dragons and sword fights and I guess some cinematic scenes. So it's me.
Right on. Welcome. Next up, we have my dear Patricia A. Jackson. How are you?
Oh, you're adorable. That is so sweet. My name is Patricia A. Jackson, and my debut novel, Forging a Nightmare, came out in November from Angry Robot Books. It's about fallen angels, Nephilim, nightmares. If you are a fan of horses and a galloping pace in a novel, then it is definitely the book for you, and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. And next up, we have J.S. Dewis. How are you?
Hi, good. Thanks for having me. So my debut novel and its sequel came out last year, The Last Watch and The Exiled Fleet. I have them here to show them off for you.
Yeah.
They are Battlestar Galactica meets Night's Watch from Game of Thrones in space. So if you like sci-fi, space opera, stuff like that, you will enjoy those. So yeah, I'm excited I'm a filmmaker by trade. I was an indie filmmaker for a long time, so I'm excited to talk to you guys.
Cool. Good to have you here. And David Walters just jumped into the private chat and said that was 2 books, Jenny. So you messed up already.
You can't stop me, David. I'm wild.
They both came out in 1 year. Just let her have it, man.
I know, right? 4 months apart. It was rough.
And finally, we have Gareth Hanrahan joining us. How are you?
Not too bad. I'm Gareth Hanrahan. I'm fantasy writer. I'm doing a series for Orbit Books, The Black Iron Legacy. And with my other hat on, I write role-playing games. And that's me.
Right on. Well, good to have you here. Glad to have all of you here. I'm really excited to be chatting about this topic. First off, just for everyone who's watching, if you jump into the live chat with any questions, I will get to them at some point. I might bring them up casually in the conversation if the mood is right. And sorry, everybody, for my voice. I'm just getting over a cold, so it's a bit more gravelly and sexy than usual. But
you're too much.
Whatever, Patty. So to start off, I just want to ask everybody, when I say cinematic storytelling, what does that mean to you? So we'll start with you, Jenny.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's something you can visualize easy in your head, and that, goes down differently for different people. But I think it's something where you don't get tripped up by the visuals. You don't ever have to wonder how that action or blocking would have worked. It just kind of flows naturally in that way in your brain.
Yeah. And Brian, what about you?
Well, Jenny's a cinematographer, so I feel like it's hard for me to add anything that's
man.
in any way more intelligent. I can just say a bunch of things I think, and she can tell me how wrong I am about it. No, I tend to think of it as there's, maybe less focused on internal thought and more on kind of visual action and stuff like that. Not that there's, no internal thought, not like it's reading like a script necessarily, but I feel like when something is very cinematic to me, most of the stuff that's going on and stuff, I feel like I can see, and it's very, very movement based and something like that.
Cool. And Hugh, what about you? What's your take on cinematic storytelling?
I know when I'm reading it, sometimes the page just kind of falls away and you don't see the words anymore, and you actually can the world just comes to life, and these guys were saying, it becomes visual instead of reading the words and trying to piece it together. And what's crazy is when it happens to you as a writer and you're no longer like even aware of what you're writing. You just see what's happening and you're transcribing it. But every now and then when I fall into that zone, like there's the days you have to do very little editing. It just comes out like so crisp and clear and concise and visual. And trying to recapture that, figure out why that happens sometimes and how to do it more consistently, I think is a big key to having good days as a writer.
Mm-hmm. And Patty, what's your take?
It is the immersive world. As a teacher, I want to leave the world sometimes, and I want someone to land the Millennium Falcon at my door or the unicorn and give me that character that I will go to hell and back again with.
Just whisk me away.
Whisk me away and just take me away from papers and screaming parents and things like that. It's just that immersive experience. That's just the roller coaster ride, and I just don't want to get off.
Cool. And Gareth, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of showing, not telling, an emphasis on like visual imagery, motion, and action, as opposed to the lengthy pages on the internal thoughts of the character.
Yeah, I mean, you've all brought up points that in researching and digging a bit deeper into this idea of cinematic storytelling, specifically in the frame of books, it's gotten me thinking a lot. Perhaps when we talk about a book being cinematic, maybe what we mean is it's, everyone has different approaches and different takes on this, but something that could be easily adapted into a movie or television show based on the way that it jumps off the page, based on the pace that it has. And these are all things that we'll get into, but, with the familiar excitement of the visual medium on the page, does anyone think that that's a valid approach to starting this discussion? Whoever wants to jump in there.
I have often said that I have the attention span of a dead goldfish. And if you are going to describe to me a dress in 2 pages, I'm gone. I will look for a place.
Hi, Robert Jordan.
And I subscribe to the school of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Let's go get the bad critter and let's run. I call it the galloping pace. And I know for myself, for my debut novel, a lot of folks don't like it because it is very fast. It doesn't waste any time. But then there are some folks who love it because they say it's so visual and it's so rich and it doesn't waste any space and it doesn't let you breathe until you get to the middle of the book. And that's really what I want, like a movie. I don't want to waste any time and I want to spin my tires. It's like, let's roll.
Does anyone else want to jump in there?
Yeah, I agree with everything Patty's saying, and I know some of like action sequences tend to be thought of as more cinematic than introspection and the quiet times between the action set pieces. But I like all kinds of cinema. I like some very slow, majestic, like imposing, moody cinema. And I think there's a writing style. I'm not claiming to have this ability, but I know when reading, sometimes I encounter some writing that's cinematic without being quick necessarily. It's just, I feel so, and I think Patty used the word immersion earlier. I think that's the right way of thinking about it. I feel so immersed in the mood and the setting and the scene that I can see it perfectly. And I think to her point as well about those are the things that are easier to imagine getting adapted. I think a lot of people who are looking at works to adapt, it's like if someone who knows how to fix up an old house can see a fixer-upper and imagine what it's going to be, and they're like, look, the bones are fine, this is going to work. But most producers and most people in Hollywood, in my experience, are looking for stuff that's almost already there, so they don't have to imagine all the hard work it'll take. And I think authors who write in a cinematic way are doing themselves a favor in helping people imagine like what this old house is going to become, basically.
Right. Brian, Gareth, Jenny, do any of you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I think it's funny what Patricia said about having kind of a short attention span as a writer. I think that's definitely true of me too. And my patience for describing stuff is fairly low. It's like, all right, we've got a city, like do like 1 or 2 sentences, and like I'm done here. And that, like everyone can see the city. We're moving on. And the same, like I struggle with writing like the internal thoughts of my characters in a way that it's not where I normally go. It feels like kind of pulling teeth. I don't know what it is. I feel like, I've watched a lot of Brene Brown videos on vulnerability as a person. Like, I think that I can express my internal thoughts well out in the world as a real person, but as a writer, when I have to like explain how a person feels about a thing, I'm like, this is awful. Let's just like have them. It's got some dialogue and some fights going on. So I feel like it wasn't so much like a deliberate thing for me. It's more like a short attention span and just being more gravitating towards like keeping things moving and like dialogue and action. Doing descriptions and internal thoughts is like I never do it if I can avoid it.
But there is a lot to say about a character through their action and their dialogue. No, we will get deeper into this. I mean, just the difference between, I guess, external and internal representations of a character, and obviously that's something that cinema plays a lot with. But then books can also do that. If you're someone like Brian who doesn't like describing a city or a character's internal thoughts, but you can convey so much information through physical action and dialogue with other characters. Yeah,
I think that's true. And I do it some. I remember when my agent was first kind of giving me line notes, like way back when we wanted to submit this before we submitted it. And like, every few pages, he was like, but how do they feel about this? I'm like, well, I don't know. He cut the head off of a dragon. He feels good about it. Like it went well.
Yeah. Gareth, do you want to get in on this? You got a big smile on your face.
Well, I certainly empathize with the whole, like, but how do they feel about it?
Who cares?
Who cares? But in the middle of this, actually, in my case, lengthy descriptions of the cities are very much my thing. I think a part of the cinematic approach is also a sense of space that, that certainly when I'm writing like an action scene or just like even just characters moving through the world, I want to where they are relative to other things. I want to be able to make it feel like a real place and also know how they're moving through it. In my novels, it also have this one sort of weird, fantastic city, and I haven't drawn a map of it, but in my head, I will know if you're standing on this particular street, you'll be able to look over there and see these towers in the distance, whereas this other place is blocked by this hill.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when we talk about sort of cinematic fantasy, what instantly comes to mind, giant battle scenes and the siege by this turret, we got the whole armies lined up and where each thing is. Which again sort of translates right to the screen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean that kind of thing. Cinema can include big action set pieces, but Gareth, I'm reading some of your work right now, and
oh dear.
There's come on, man, be modest. The way that you describe the city itself is also cinematic in its own particular way, and is compensating for something that the visual medium of television and film inherently has built into it, just with that visual aspect. So the way that you set the scene, even if it's just a paragraph of establishing what's visible, you don't have a map in your books, but I still have a sense in my head, and I'm creating this imaginary city grid and city layout, and things make sense, and it doesn't throw me out of the narrative at all. It immerses me. Going back to something that Patricia talked about. Yeah. Jenny, do you want to get in on here?
Yeah, so there's a couple of, everybody made great points. I think a couple of things that I was thinking about was, as far as like conveying feelings is, we think of it often as being internal, but one thing I like to do is to put my characters in a room together and make them talk about their feelings. And that's something that comes across as more cinematic than just putting a character in their own brain and having them think about what's going on. So one thing I like to try to do is, after a big action sequence or when we're coming down off of something, is to put them in a room together and force them to talk about it. And something Patricia mentioned about pacing was getting me thinking about the same kind of thing where, when I have written some feature films and things like that, just indie things, but you have 90 pages to make a story go, and that is a very short amount of time. So you really have to be efficient with everything you're doing. And you can't get into that character's head, so they have to talk about it with other people, or unless you're doing, I hate voiceover, but you can do voiceover and things like that to get around it, but I think that's cheap, so I don't like that. But so yeah, you just have to be really efficient. So if you, some of the, a lot of the, like Save the Cat, I know people read, I haven't read it myself, but a lot of those, film writing books, people are picking up now and getting tips from to write, novels. And I think that's, coming from the streaming age now and stuff like that, we're just used to that kind of pacing in our stories. So it's becoming more and more prevalent.
That's an interesting point. The fact that we are in this golden age of television, streaming, cinema, what have you, how that is kind of creating this feedback loop with the literature that's coming out these days, and perhaps what agents and editors and publishers are looking for, and thus that feeds back into the cinematic world with adaptations. So I'm curious, for all of you, how does that feedback loop feel personally, where you have the things that you're watching and the things that you're writing, and how those two intersect in terms of your influence and your inspiration? So whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, I can just jump back in. I honestly am much more of a consumer of video games and TV and movies than I ever was a reader. Like, my reading habits have really only picked up since I started writing. I read a lot as a kid, but once I got into filmmaking, being an indie filmmaker is extremely time consuming. You don't have time for hobbies. So, audiobooks helped, but you're on the road a lot, you're out of town a lot, you're working 16-hour days, you're not reading. So I just didn't get a lot of reading in my early adulthood. So I feel like I'm more influenced by, those things than any other type of medium at the moment. And I feel like a lot of people are starting to get that way a little more. And then then I go and I read more books, and they are more like what newer books are more like what I just watched, and etc. So yeah, I think you're right about it feeling like a feedback loop, and I like it because I don't know, like, that's the kind of stories I like reading. I get immersed in them. I don't get bored by them, like we were saying. And so I think it's a good thing.
Do you have any examples from your novels, The Last Watch or The XL Fleet?
Examples as far as
I guess, like, scenes or ways that you approached certain things in your work that you felt could have been drawn from cinema or television.
Yeah, I mean, literally the entire structure I Discovery wrote, or pantsed, if you want to call it that. The Last Watch. I know. It's okay. And afterwards, I kind of fit it into a structure, and I realized that I used the 5-act structure that I always used for writing scripts, and I didn't even realize I did it. So I think it just became kind of an inherent thing that I was doing while I just learned how to tell the stories that way, and then that's how they came out in novel form as well. So I think just the structure in general, and then like we were saying, kind of the efficiency and the different tools to convey internals and world building and things, like putting two characters in a room versus having a character sitting around thinking about something, or 10 pages of exposition can turn into an engaging scene instead, because you have to tell it that way in a script and for a movie.
And Katie Tree in the comments has a funny question. Are editors therapists for characters? But how do they feel about this? I also think dialogue is therapy for characters, for cinematic writers too.
Definitely.
Does anyone want to get in on this notion of feedback loop, and then share some examples from their work?
Yeah, sure. I am the same, where I've always read a lot, but I consumed a lot of comics and video games and TV and film. And I think you absorb kind of like the storytelling structure through all of these mediums. And so even though you might not know the theory, when you start telling your story, you might tell a hero's journey and you never learned about it, but every story that, major impactful story that you absorbed had it. So it's like learning to sing on key because you've heard other people sing on key. And I think it's always struck me that, like, my 3 best-selling works were all serialized works that came out in an episodic fashion. Yeah. And growing up on comics and TV, where like every every issue had its own arc, and then across 10 issues or a season of TV you had a bigger arc. And I just found that writing in that style was comfortable and more impactful for me as a writer. And it turns out that's what has been successful for me as a writer as well. So it's what readers, at least some readers, crave, or it just suits my writing style. So I think that feedback loop has definitely been happening with my work, where the stuff I've consumed has influenced the stuff that I create.
Yeah, the serialized thing is very interesting, because thinking back on it, I'm like, yeah, Hugh, you did release Wool originally in little parcels, and I think on one hand that kind of ties into the ability to engage viewers, or in this case readers, in the same way that a weekly television show does, where you leave the show at the end credits and people are like, oh shit, I want to keep watching, but they have to wait a week.
Yeah.
But it's a week of anticipation, and then when they get to it, they devour it, and
then
that continues and continues.
Yeah, there was communication between readers and between myself and readers during the pauses in between. But so all three things that have been by far the most successful for me were things that I wrote thinking they wouldn't be successful. Like, I wasn't thinking commercial. I was writing novels, and then I would break off and write this serialized thing. So Wool, Sand, and Beacon 23 were all written that way, and they all came out in 5 parts. And those are the 3 things that are the furthest along in being adapted. So it's like I was serving up to producers and studios, like, here's something that's already in an episodic format for you.
Right.
So it's wild that, like, I did not have I've never had a brilliant idea in my life. I definitely didn't have a brilliant plan in my writing career, but I stumbled into, like, emulating these serialized stories that I'd absorbed, and now they're being turned back into that. We've got gonna have 2 shows filming at the same time, something I never thought would happen to me once in my life. And I probably owe it all to, like, the TV that my parents told me not to watch when I was a kid.
Thanks, Mom and Dad. Well, I'm curious. We'll get back into your experiences now that you have work being adapted right at this moment. But first, Patty, Brian, or Gareth, do you want to get in on the feedback loop idea?
Yeah. Go ahead, Patricia.
Oh, well, to the viewer who talked about writing being a therapy, or, editors being therapy for their characters, that sort of thing. Yeah. Writing is a therapy. It's an exorcism in some cases. And as far as the feedback loop, I have to giggle, because I can tell you what movie I was watching when I wrote a particular scene. And to give you case in point, I was sitting in class and we were talking about the slave trade in my class, and they were showing us images of what the slave ships would have looked like beneath decks, I should say. And I always get a little leery because it just makes me bristle, because it's so awful. And there was a scene in my book where there's a museum exhibit that emulates a slave ship, where you have to, like, crawl and crouch beneath these low decks, and and they're just statues, but you can hear the voices of the slaves moaning. And it's one of the most powerful sections in the book, because the 2 protagonists are pissed at each other as they're going through this section, and there's just this turmoil. So as a Black woman, talking about the experience of being a Black woman and the PTSD that you have from being in this country, from the experiences that you see in politics and the news and the media, and the racism and not being included when you just want to have a seat at the table, it becomes an exorcism for you as a writer. And I always say to my kiddos in creative writing class that writing is a healing thing for you. So you talk about that feedback loop. You're going through some stuff, and you go and you put your characters through some stuff, and you learn with them how to cope. And it's pretty interesting.
No, I like that. Brian, Gareth, do you want to build on that and talk about the feedback loop?
Well, I was just going to say, for me, I think the aspect of my writing process where I've leaned the most on kind of inspiration from TV shows and movies is usually when I've really screwed up a plot line. I don't know how to fix it, which happens all the time. I don't make outlines either. Or I make terrible outlines and abandon them. I get myself into huge amounts of trouble. So the times where I've really leaned on it, I'm like, this is a whole storyline that is not working. I don't even know what I'm trying to do here. And I've actually found it's really helpful to be like, all right, this storyline is going to be like the plot line of that movie Collateral that Michael Mann made, which was with
good movie.
Jamie Foxx. Yeah, like a really good movie and a super like, I don't know, good backbone for a plot line. It's like, all right, this is now what these two characters are kind of doing, and it can be a really good guideline for me. And I don't, it's not necessarily the cinematic nature of it. Maybe just the plotting elements of movies have fewer like, I don't know. They tend to be pretty stripped down most of the time, and so that's been helpful for me when I've made wild writing and strategic mistakes, and I need to like fix it in a hurry because I'm under deadline and I've made a serious mistake. I think that's where I really lean on them the most, is to fix my own errors.
Yeah, I love how you call it strategic mistakes, though, because I don't think like, you know, with my own writing, I don't ever view a mistake as, you know, a black hole, this thing that I could never escape from.
Mm-hmm.
The best part of it is just to twist it on its head and think like, how could I use this strategically to make it beneficial and learn from that? Maybe cut it out completely, but still learn from it and not just have it be this fucking dump on my ego or anything like that, you know?
I think that's true. I'm more forgiving of myself when I'm not like a month away from my deadline and realize that I'm about to rewrite a whole thing. But other than that, yeah, you're right. And I think like, you know, rewriting and realizing why something is messed up and fixing it is actually a really good, you know, a good part of becoming a better writer for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And Gareth, what's your take on all this?
Actually, thinking about like, you know, fixing errors, one trick that has worked for me in the past is sort of taking this like, you know, broken manuscript and approaching it as if I am the one who's like, you know, taking this book and going to adapt it into a screenplay. Because then you get away from like focusing on the individual like word sentence structure and to drag your brain up to a more structural level, and can like you look at like how the plot goes and how the sort of characters develop over the full course of the work as opposed to individual scenes, which is very handy because you then sort of shout at yourself as a third person, like, you know, look, this idiot is terrible, look, I'm going to fix it now.
That's a cool approach, though. I like it because essentially you're
adapting your brain, basically,
yeah, you're adapting the idea in your head into the book screenplay thing that exists on the page. Patty, you mentioned something earlier. I think everyone's mentioned this at some point, but pacing, I think, is one of those things that really defines cinema and television, obviously because of time restriction a lot of the times. And then obviously you have some films that purposefully play with the pacing and drag it out longer in order to evoke a certain tension or mood or what have you. But from all of your perspectives, you know, with things like pacing and how chapters themselves are organized, or for example, ending a chapter on a cliffhanger in order to entice someone to continue reading, what are your thoughts on this and how do you approach that kind of thing? So whoever wants to get in there.
I think we've all sort of like internalized like the language of television and cinema much more than sort of previous generations. Like at the moment, I'm reading through this book of old Irish genre stories. They're like going back to the first one in it is John Ma's Proposal, and basically it's these really old folk tales or piece of fiction.
This English teacher is very happy that you just said that. Thank you. Love that.
But they're all really really slow, or just like, you know, zip through so fast you don't get a chance to catch anything. So I think we're all sort of like, you know, calibrated now to sort of pace out a story at sort of television or cinematic pace.
Whoever else wants to get in on this.
I love ending a chapter in a way that makes the reader have to turn the next page. I think the secret to that is you want to provide a satisfying conclusion to something that was raised in a previous chapter within that chapter, so that you're wrapping one thing up while you reveal another problem. And in screenplays are called stingers, these like post-credit or after the story's ended. There's like, I think now Marvel has made them kind of more standard, but they used to be pretty rare. And I think there's a version of that in prose writing where you you give something to satisfy the reader, and then you give something to dissatisfy them. And it's that feeling of not having closure. Like if you, when I'm reading and trying to find a place to put a book down, I'm always looking for a place where I feel satisfied with this predicament of the characters in that moment. And the really great writers that I, get mad at because I can't put their books down, have a way of like never leaving me perfectly satisfied. And I think finding that balance, so you're not upsetting people, you're not stringing them along. It's not the same. It can't be the same thing that left them hanging at the previous chapter. So you got to learn how to wrap those things up while you peel another layer back. And when you pull it off, you just know, like you're writing, you don't know when the chapter is going to end, and then you write that sentence, and you're like, oh, they're going to hate me when they read that. And then page break, new chapter, and they're right along the ride with you. You're not letting them go.
Oh, I love that though. There's part of me that's just like, piece of shit, but just, I love this book so much that I can't help but keep reading. And that to me is the sign of, it doesn't necessarily have to be a cliffhanger, but I think you nailed it when you said satisfy, then dissatisfy, enough where you irk people that they can't help by the basis of their stupid human nature to just keep reading your book. I love that.
The best compliments I've ever gotten are like angry emails from people who were like getting absorbed in a book and kept missing their subway stops every morning, or were up till 3 o'clock in the morning and like a wreck at work the next day. So it's they're complimenting you and also pointing out how disruptive your work was in their life, and I think that's a real good sign. Yeah,
disruptive work is always good. Anyone else? Patricia, Jenny, Brian?
Go ahead. I am a horseback rider and I love to go galloping. So that's pretty much what my pace is, a galloping pace. I know sometimes in my writers group, they ask me to linger at certain things. We ain't got no time to linger. It's like dealing with kids, kids do something kind of silly and you kind of put them in their place and you move on. There's no lingering that has to go on. I love seeing my chapters as short stories with a beginning and a middle and an end. And I like what Hugh said about you drop a little kernel of something and then you move on. And then the next one, you let that kernel blossom and bloom into something. You answer a question, drop a few more under the surface, and then you keep moving. Very rarely will I have chapters that will continue from the previous chapter. If I'm still walking down the road 3 chapters later, you're doing something wrong. I'm getting ready to leave. I'm getting ready to start skipping in the book. It's time to get moving to the next issue. And I don't want to miss anything. So I keep reading, but I'm tired of walking down the road. I'm past Tolkien where they're walking all the time, as my kids always say. Let's go look at some Nazgul. Let's go.
Show me the cool stuff, man.
That's right. Show me cool stuff.
And Patty, that was a very good cinematic popcorn reference with Colonel there. Nicely done. I don't even think
return to the popcorn theme.
Brian?
Yeah, no, what people have been saying, maybe it reminded me of I was reading an interview about the showrunner for Breaking Bad, Vince, I can't remember his last name. But he was talking about his writing process, and he was saying that he likes putting the writer's room into like backing them against a corner. And so he was talking about the last season of Breaking Bad, and I don't know if anyone's seen it, but there's like a very large gun in a trunk that's brought up very early on in the last season. And I guess when they were writing it, he brought up that without having any idea what he was going to do with it.
It was the biggest Chekhov's gun I've ever seen.
Exactly, right. And they just had to find a way to fulfill it. But he was saying, we almost abandoned it because we couldn't figure out what the payoff was going to be for this kind of cliffhanger and this thing that was supposed to be building suspense. And I read that interview like a month or two ago, so it wasn't like I wasn't actively doing that when I was writing. But I think that I tend to accidentally do that because as I'm approaching the end of a chapter, I'm starting to get bored. So I try to throw something at myself that I have to figure out later on. And then a lot of times I do have to abandon it because I can't get it fulfilled. But I think it can be helpful for me at least to just give myself a pretty big cliffhanger challenge and just see if I can get it figured out. So I think that can be a good way of building suspense too, is just you don't really know what you're going to do or how you're going to get it figured out. But, if you throw it out as a challenge for yourself, it challenges the reader too. And I was also going to say, I can always tell when there's been like a little spike in sales for me, because I get more emails of people saying like, hey, I like Blood of an Exile, but you pissed me off here, 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 and here. And, you know, I need to tell you about that. I'm like, cool. Well, thanks for reading.
Just going to stick that into my internal writer's room, and I'm going to back myself into more corners, right?
There you go. Yeah.
Jenny, do you want to get in on this?
Yeah, so it's interesting you're saying that, and I know, Adrian, you are going to be mad at me about the pantsing thing, but
I'm not mad at you. I just like bugging you.
You just think I'm crazy, yeah. But I feel like for me, it's like I'm along for the ride, just like my reader will be. So if I'm entertained and going, oh, what will happen next? You know, my reader will be too. So that's kind of why I like taking that approach when I can. I mean, you know, once you are selling books, they kind of want to see outlines and things like that, which is terrible, but I figured it out, and then I write a different book and they print it anyways. But yeah, so before I started writing my own work, I actually for a couple of years wrote fan fiction, and it's sort of like what Hugh was saying about, you know, having serialized content. Like I would put up a chapter of fan fiction and everyone would be like, oh my God, and feedback. And then the next week, or I was doing it daily for a while, I'd post another one and it was the same sort of thing. And so I think I kind of trained myself there to always find a scene break, basically, is how I think of them. Like, where are we going to cut to the next scene at? And actually the first version of The Last Watch, like, didn't have any scene breaks within chapters because I didn't even think about that as being a thing I could do. I just, like, every chapter had to be a scene, and then we go to the next chapter and there's no scene breaks. So I now know about scene breaks, so I use those. But yeah, so that is very ingrained in my process just naturally from the beginning, both through script writing and fan fiction.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about sort of tension and things like that. Brian, you brought that up. I know you don't like description. It's fine. I don't hate you for it. But how important are things like description or things beyond dialogue or character movement, action, in terms of establishing and maintaining a reader's sense of tension and rhythm within a story?
Well, I should say, it's not that I hate description. I struggle. I struggle with static description of, you know, what someone's wearing, or like just like what a city or like the forest looks like. But I think I've been told that I describe, you know, action sequences and violence in far too much detail. I don't think that my books are that violent, but other people do. I mean, I think description is incredibly important. I think that if you can't see something in your mind's eye, then it's. I think that's the ideal thing. Kind of like you was saying at the beginning, you're not really seeing words; they're just kind of, it's living in your head. But I think that there are just a lot of ways to do that. You know, Gareth seems like he's got, you know, tons of descriptions of the city, which comes alive in your head, and then you've got that kind of background. And I think my approach tends to be much more describing things that are happening, you know, movement in the moment, I guess, and like lots of dialogue and stuff like that. But either way, it's the same effect, which is that you can really feel a place inside of you versus, you know, trying to just parse out words and figure it out from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's this kind of 1-2 punch of description, living and breathing along with character action and dialogue and those kinds of things. And Patty, I think we've talked about this before. Really quickly though, Katie has another question for Brian. How important is description of dragon poo?
I have also gotten flack for mentioning feces too much in my book. There was like one paragraph about dragon poop in the third book, and it was inspired in terms of, you know, cinema stuff. It was inspired by that scene in Jurassic Park, the big Triceratops poop. I was like, well, I have huge dragons in my books, and I would be remiss if I don't have something like that in this trilogy. But it was like maybe 2 paragraphs about the huge piles of dragon poop. I think it was 1. My paragraphs are short.
So Patty, when you've been critiquing my work, you bring up things like how dialogue is interspersed with things like description. Do you want to jump off on that point and kind of describe how you approach the equilibrium of description and dialogue and all these things that help dictate tension and rhythm for readers?
Well, first of all, I want to be besties with Brian because I think our inner roles are Yeah, that could be the end of the world. Just saying.
Dragon poo, so juvenile.
Talk about it.
It's how I make most of my friends. So it's the common bond. So we are now forever joined.
When I first sent my manuscript to my agent, one of the things that she scolded me for is that I had too much dialogue. I don't know if there can be such a thing, because I really do love dialogue. But she did tick me off to the fact that you have to have a balance of the narration with your description, some character thought, some dialogue. I'm still kind of heavy on the dialogue because I just enjoy it. But you do need to let a reader know where they are, and you have to have that stage direction. And Jen's going to love this. There's this mise en scène thing that you do in cinema where you have the stage directions, you have your lighting, costume, and makeup. And it's the cinema thing that you have to bring to the two-dimensional story in order to raise it off the page as three-dimensional. One of the things that I learned was from Michael Stackpole. Michael Stackpole tries to avoid dialogue tags as much as he can, and he likes to use attributions. So instead of saying Adrian did or Adrian said, Adrian rolled his eyes as he moved back to the microphone, and it works.
Don't you even, Patty?
And it works really, really well. And I try to teach my kids that in class. Get rid of the dialogue. I know, or dialogue tags. Most people ignore the ask, the said, that sort of thing. It also eliminates using weird ones like growled and grumbled, which I think is perfectly okay. But if you read some other books, you shouldn't do that. But the attributions will give a sense of place and a sense of time, and even sometimes a sense of character mood. So that's what I find to be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Jenny, do you want to jump in on that mise en scene thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything, Patricia, you're saying is great. Like, that's the thing that I do as well. I try to avoid using said and asked and things like that as much as I can, and just making it, we call it blocking, where characters are in space in the scene. So that's the thing that I actually end up getting tripped up on, and my editor will be like, hey, you wrote a nice dialogue sequence here, but what the hell is going on? Like, what are these characters doing? And then I have to go in and actually kind of add those as usually dialogue tags where it's like you were saying, you sit down or you crack your knuckles or they are doing whatever. So I kind of skip over that sometimes and get into my script writing mode and just like go through the dialogue because that's the fun part. And then I forget to fill in like, okay, what the hell is actually happening during all of this? So yeah, I do. What was the point of this question again? I'm forgetting.
We've gone off the rails.
It's okay.
It's we need some narration just to come in between all of our talking.
It's not the usual tight ship that I'm running on SFF Addicts. I apologize. It's more so about the balance, the equilibrium between description and dialogue. And
description, right? Okay.
That help readers and guide them along.
Yeah. So as a reader, one of the things I like about reading is filling in the blanks of things with my brain and thinking up descriptions and wondering how things look. So I try to be as sparse with descriptions as I can while still giving the reader a general sense of what's happening so they don't feel lost, but they can still feel in the details kind of how they want to in their mind. Because that's just kind of, that's what I like when I read. So I try to do the same thing, which results in pretty sparse descriptions typically. And that comes back to efficiency where I really, sometimes I'll write like 5 sentences about, if we're going to spend a lot of time in this room and I know that it's going to come up in the book, it's going to be the setting of 20 scenes, then I'm going to spend more time describing it. But then usually my editor's like, hey, you could do this in 1 sentence. And it's like, cool, yes, I could. And then going back through and kind of figuring out how to make those things more efficient and still getting across the same information.
Yeah. And I mean, you can, in the case where it's a setting that's going to appear again and again, you can sort of flesh that out and sparse out the descriptions of it to build a more complex picture. And I think, Gareth, This is something that you do really well in your Black Iron Legacy, where you're giving a sense of place and space through your description, but it's not bombarded all at once so that you're just like, oh shit, this info dump is just overwhelming me.
My characters can't look at eyes without contemplating its history for 2 paragraphs. Like, she walked through a gate. The gate takes you back to the city's Ashen period when X, Y, Z happened. But yeah, actually, on the topic of narration and description and cinematics, I was rereading Dune there after watching the movie. And it struck me that is the least cinematic book possible in ways, because half the book is internal thoughts, jumping
Exactly.
from character from head to head. If you were going to pick a book to adapt, that would not be it.
Mental walking. It's mental walking.
Yeah.
Actually, this is.
I think
Go
there are
ahead.
ways of doing internal monologue and description and internal thinking that's very cinematic and immersive. I think it's Dune is an example of that, where there's some in long passages with no dialogue at all that you can't stop reading. It's so gripping. So I think it's, there's the old saying that like doing scaring people is easy and making people laugh is difficult. Like humor is much harder, I think, to be good at than just like action and shocking stuff. And I think there are levels of ease with different types of writing. And for a lot of us, dialogue is like the easiest thing because we do a lot of it. We're used to, that's how we communicate. We're used to having conversations with people. And when we start to imagine our worlds, it's easy to have fake conversations between our characters and just copy that down. I think the hard part is making the descriptive stuff as gripping and immersive, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible or that they can't go together. It's just next level difficult. And it's not necessary often with a good, especially with good genre fiction. Like you don't need to have that skill to have a good story, but if you can do it, and some of the greats, Octavia Butler is like amazing at that. Ursula K. Le Guin, Isaac Asimov, like some of these classics. If you go look at their books, there's huge sections with no dialogue in them, and you wouldn't say they're plotting or they're slow. And I don't know if I have the solution to how to pull that off. I would just say that I don't think that they link that necessarily the cinematic nature of a book comes with things happening or things being said. It comes with the what's being said and how it's being said.
This actually ties in perfectly. Jeremy Zoll, shout out to Jeremy. How are you? He wrote a comment asking, do you usually write your description objectively, or do you filter it through character voice and intensely close POV, which ties really nicely to what you were saying, Hugh. Anyone who wants to get in on that. And
that's exactly right. If you do your description through your characters' emotions and how they're seeing it, then it sounds like dialogue, like it has their voice and their character and flavor in it. This kind of goes to what our whole panel is about, being cinematic. The writing advice I give to myself when I'm sitting down to write is do not write from a isometric overhead view of describing what's happening. Zoom into a first person perspective. And when you describe the world, it's like through your character's lens. And so it has their personality and their fears and their failings and their hopes and their dreams are baked into how they're seeing the world and the things they're hearing and smelling and feeling. And so I'm always like, zoom in, get behind their eyes. Don't tell the plot, tell the character's experience.
That's perfect. Actually, that's one of my biggest questions, and one of the things that I'm so closely linking between cinematic and POV is how close do you show that POV, and how do you sort of play with interiority? Because I think interiority is something that novels have a leg up on cinema and television in terms of what you can do from internal narration. And Gareth, you brought up Dune. There's a lot of interiority in Dune, and a lot of people said for a very long time that Dune is one of the unadaptable movies, but it depends on how you want to adapt it and what your take on POV is in doing that adaptation. So does anyone want to build on top of this in terms of how POV and interiority play into the cinematic storytelling?
As a pantser, a very proud pantser, but you done. I always say to my kids, you have to put the character onesie on. You have to become that character, and careful. You have a child, be careful. And you have to be able to become that character and see through their eyes, just like you were saying. I am a big D&D player. and I have been wrecked by Tiamat. So in my novel, I was able to get my revenge on Tiamat, and I'm like, what is the worst punishment you could give to that particular creature? And I had her heads cut off, and she's part of a fountain now. And my character is seeing this as if I'm playing a D&D game. I'm also a big gamer, and I like to immerse myself and become that character. And in my writing, I do the exact same thing. It's not like you're the observer. You have to be the participant and be there in that moment and imagine what that feels like, not just seeing it, hearing it, sensing it, tasting it, depending upon what that situation is. Put the onesie on, become the character.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Yeah, I definitely do the same thing where I put myself in the character's shoes. And I think that, it depends on the type of story you're trying to tell, but typically when we're talking about genre fiction, it's usually, pretty close POVs, typically modern genre fiction. So I definitely do that myself. And I find myself kind of linking it back to my cinematography is what I focused on in film. And, choosing what is in each frame is incredibly important, and it's not only about lighting, but it's about communicating with every other department, and what goes into that frame is, the viewer experience. And that's the same thing I'm kind of trying to do when I'm looking through my character's eyes, is what specifically about this scene is going to convey, themes or foreshadowing or any number of things that, you need to come up later in the thing, and just thinking about all of those things from a really close perspective, and just how to visualize like what kinds of, sights, sounds, scents, all the things that you can do in a book that sometimes you can't always do in a, in a film, is kind of nice to convey those things. And I think as far as, getting internal, it's the same kind of thing where I trend toward, if a character doesn't know something that the audience needs to know, I put them in a room with someone that knows it and they talk about it. So then the other person can be like, oh, here's the info you need to know. And then it's not like this internal dump of the other character. So that's what I like about writing 2 POVs, which my debut series is 2 POVs, although the book I'm revising right now is 1. And that's where I'm coming up against, I don't have another character to switch to, and so that they can talk about things. But yeah, I think it's just finding that balance and staying nice and close, I think, is definitely the way to go.
Mm-hmm. And your writer's room is pushed up against a wall. So take a lesson from Brian. Brian, Gareth, do you want to get in on this POV debate? Not debate,
I was going to
discussion.
say, I 100% agree. Kind of describing something the way your character would describe it is, in my mind, like the mark of really, really good writing and really immersive stories. And I think it's one of those things that when I was querying for agents, I got a rejection. The agent had read the full thing, but she was like, "I'm not going to take it. It's really good, but all the characters sound the same." And like end of story, that was it. And I took that to heart, and I was like, I will rewrite every perspective except for one. But what was interesting about it is that I actually think that that's a place for me as a writer. I have the most to like work and learn, and like it's a matter of 3 or 4 words being changed or restructured to really nail a character's perspective. And an author who, I love her books, I love Fondelee's books, but read them slowly, because every 2 paragraphs I'm like, oh god, that was the perfect way of putting that. God damn it, I'm like, she's so much better than I am, and I have to like go rethink my whole life in a corner. And I think that that's like, yeah, the books that I've loved the most, that's probably the through line, actually, now that I think about it. They have just these pitch perfect descriptions that are also showing your character's worldview just over and over and over again, especially when you're doing it when you've got multiple POVs, especially 2 characters who wind up, you see it from both their perspectives, the same thing, and they describe it differently. And it's like just these subtle things that can just be so perfect. And I think that's like one of the hardest things to do. And definitely I'm constantly reminded of how much better I could be at that when I read other people's work that I really enjoy.
But that's the journey as an author. Constantly improve.
Just feeling bad about yourself.
Any critic, self-loathing. Gareth, do you want to get in on this?
No, the one thing, like thinking of my own books, egotistically, I've realized with the conversation that all 4 books I've written so far, they've all started with me finding some excuse to have a point of view character looking out over like the setting, and then zooming in. So like one like actually 2 started with someone like on a flying creature approaching a city and going, gosh, that's where everything is, and then zooming in.
Establishing shot.
Yeah, the Gutter opens with like everything from the point of view of a building that's being robbed. I think it was, I'm trying to find a balance between like the omniscient narrator who's able to say, you know, "Lo, here's the setting for our tale," and sort of the modern trend towards close POV.
Hugh, do you have any takes on this?
Yeah, so many. You just mentioned establishing shot, Adrian. I think that's something key to think about when we watch film and TV. That every frame is not necessarily on a character and what they're doing and what they're seeing and saying. That there are certain tricks, and there's when they're really well done, we don't even notice them. They just disappear. But the car pulling up, the door opening, a foot coming out, like we show how they got to where they are. And I think there's a skill in writing where you do these kinds of establishing shots and the sinew that kind of holds the action and the dialogue together. And I think doing that in a way that they kind of paint the picture in the reader's mind, but then disappear as well, so that you're not even aware of it. Like that's the real challenge. I think one of the things that especially new writers start doing when they sit down is they're really good at writing emails and writing blog posts and Facebook posts to friends where they're super clear. They have a mental image they want to project into someone else's mind, and they do it really well. And when they sit down and write a novel, they're like, now I have to write like an author. And they get kind of ham-handed and in their own way of just painting the scene in someone else's mind. And the best writing doesn't call attention to itself, and the same with filmmaking. Like new directors try to do avant-garde shots and really weird things, and you're like, I'm watching the director play with their camera right now. And some authors are like, I'm watching them play with their words right now. And for me, cinematic storytelling means you don't notice that there's a crew there with a camera. You don't notice the author. The author gets out of the way of the story. And so I think like all these, everything everyone is talking about are elements of how to achieve that. And if there was a recipe for it, we would all have written a book on how to do this, and we would have made that book in our fiction. The point is, like, storytelling is so innate and it's such a human thing that we're all good at it without knowing how the bits and pieces work. And so when you hear authors talking about writing, you can tell that we're trying to figure it out as well. Like we do it for a living, and we still don't understand how it happens. And so it's what's great about these panels. I love being on them because I'm sitting here learning like how my profession works, because it's a mystery to me most of the time.
Yeah, and like I told Brian, it's like authors are consistently learning and applying new skills and honing their craft. And I'm so glad you brought that up, Hugh, in terms of the reader's imagination, because I think that's so important. Autumn Colquist in the chat brought up a George Orwell quote, which says, "Good writing is a window pane." And I think that's perfect, because you can't just dump so much description that the reader is left with no ability to manipulate the information that they've been given and internalize it into their own imagination such that they empathize and put themselves in the shoes of the character in the world that you've created. You need to give room for the reader's imagination to flourish and build on what you've on top of what you've given them, to the point where their imagination and whatever they've created in here subsumes and surpasses what you as an author have put on the page. And that's when you've done your job.
I don't want to ramble too long. I hate to dominate a panel, but I totally agree with that, where you want the reader's imagination to paint like which side of the room things are on and everything.
Mm-hmm.
The danger is when you start to actually build the sets and adapt the things, is that you start to piss off people. They're like, no, that's not, the character wasn't that, they weren't that height, they weren't that, their hair's wrong. Like giving readers freedom is so important, I think. But if your goal is to break into adapting your work, then there's a point where you give them enough rope to hang themselves, and you need a little more guidance in order to make sure that they're seeing the vision that you end up portraying. I mean, it's double-edged sword is all I'm going to say. Is that like giving them all the freedom of the world can disappoint when you end up making that world a
True.
reality through all kinds of different types of adaptation.
Yeah, we'll continue with this reader's imagination topic, and then later on, I want to sort of close out with this idea of adaptations. And Hugh, you can share some of your experiences, and then we've got some viewer questions that tie into that as well. Does anyone want to jump in on the notion of reader's imagination and how much you give them?
I think Hugh's absolutely correct. It is definitely a double-edged sword. And I just actually learned something on the downside of that. So thank you for that, Hugh, because I think sometimes writers are too heavy-handed and they don't allow the reader to do some of the heavy lifting. And to me, that's impressive. And I will put that book down because I do want to dictate some of the stuff with my imagination of where things are. But I can understand that they were going to get upset with you when you start building your sets or you start casting characters. But I also think that's your opportunity to throw in some flavor. Whereas someone may have imagined that particular character as being white or other, I can imagine that person being black and being very excited about that. And then the person gets cast by a black actor or an actress, and that's also very exciting. So it is a double-edged sword, but I might fall on it occasionally.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about Wheel of Time quite a lot, Patty.
I was thinking Wheel of Time.
And there's some highs and there's some lows.
Just saying.
Jenny, Gareth, or Brian, do you want to get in on this imagination discussion?
Yeah, I mean,
I
like
think
I was saying,
okay.
go ahead. Okay. Like I was saying before, I definitely like to leave room to let, that's how I like to read. I was remembering, I read Mistborn, the whole trilogy. I had filled in my head for some reason that I cannot figure out that Vin was bronze skin, bronze hair, bronze eyes. I don't know where I got this from. It's not in the book. I checked.
But
I know. I had it on an e-reader.
Okay.
I 100% though thought this for years, like for literally 10 years. And I was talking to my husband about it and talking about how that description, he's like, that's not what's happening. And he showed me all this fan art and I was like, where did I get this? And still in my head, like, that's how she looks and I cannot erase it from my brain. And I feel like, I liked that though. I thought it was cool. It looked cool in my head. Like, I want readers to be able to do that too. So I typically in my own writing, I do try to always establish skin color so that if it were to ever get adapted, I can be like, do not whitewash my book. Like, I have it in there. It is canon. Please just, if you do nothing else or don't listen to me on anything else, just don't do that. So that's one thing I always really try to do. Otherwise, I kind of let, I realized that one of the main characters, as I'm thinking about writing the third book now, I never established what their hair looks like at all. I don't even know what their hair is like. Like, what color is it? How short is it? I have no clue. They're like a main character. So stuff like that, I kind of, it just doesn't matter. So I let the reader kind of fill it in however they want. And then they can kind of fan cast in their own head, like who they think would be cool. And I've heard some readers like tell me their fan casting of my characters and who they think should play it. And it is so different than what I have in my head. So there's a lot of leeway there, I think. And when it comes to adaptations, I don't know, maybe it's because I come from the industry, but I kind of feel like I will just pass it off and they can do whatever they want. And if the check clears, I don't care.
Pass it however you want. But it sounds like it's more fun for you just to see like how individual readers imagined your characters.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. I have a Patreon now, so I have been sharing kind of the behind the scenes stuff, like my Pinterest boards for all my characters and things like that. And they'll be like, oh, I thought that this, someone said Zendaya for a character. And I was like, whoa, I never would have thought of that. That's super cool. And it's really cool to interact with readers like that and to hear what they have to say. Yeah.
Awesome. And Brian, do you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I was just thinking about it's an interesting thing to consider, and I feel like there's this thing where the more you like a character in a book, when they get adapted, I think there's a tendency that's the more you want them to fit pitch perfect, which you thought that they were going to be. And it can lead to these big disappointments. Like, it's why everyone hates all the Batman castings and stuff like that. But I was thinking, for me, I think there's also a difference between the casting announcement and a photo of an actor, either like kind of dressed up already or maybe not. And I think that causes a lot of disappointment. I remember when Game of Thrones was getting announced, the Hound had been one of my favorite characters ever since I read him. He was, my favorite part of that book, and for a long, I think still probably one of my favorite characters. And when he got cast, I remember seeing him being like, well, that Scar's wrong, and like that's not the Hound. This is gonna be terrible. And then that actor Rory, I'm really bad with generating last names today, apparently, or ever, but like he was so good, and it wasn't pitch perfect how I pictured, it when I was reading the books, but it was such an embodiment of the character that a lot of times, when you're just looking at a photo of someone, they're not actually getting to act yet and put their perspective on it. It can feel, wrong, and there's this dissonance that's not actually going to be there. But I guess that's my biggest thing. The more you love like a certain character, the more you want it to be the way you thought of it versus like the way it's going to be looking at it. I'm really curious to hear from Hugh about how, like, because obviously like you've had all these characters living and you're seeing them come to life, just if you've had those like, moments of dissonance or whatever, just, as the creator, whether you do it now or later or whatever.
Yeah, we'll get Gareth's opinion on this, and then we'll jump into the Wool adaptation. We actually have a viewer comment that's specifically talking about the character that people imagined in their head and an actor that would fit with it. And I think it's really funny in terms of who actually got cast versus what they had in their head. But Gareth, do you want to jump in for a second?
The one sort of weird experience is when you're working with artists, like for covers or if like instead of role-playing games, a lot of art direction for it. It's always weird. An image would either like be bang on right, like you send the description, they basically draw what you send them later on. Or there's a thing where where the artist discovers something about the character you didn't know, like you send them a description of a monster, and they come back and it fits better than the text you sent them because they've added their own that loops back, and that's a wonderful creative process. I'm wondering how it sort of fits into cinematic adaptations, like sort of discovering more about the story you wrote once they get their hands on it.
Yeah, and cover art is a crazy fucking thing. But I did a panel recently on it for my podcast. If anyone wants to hear, I chatted with 5 cover artists, some who are also authors, and so it's just a wild thing in terms of how someone who often has very little information creates the outer projection of this story that you wrote and is the first thing that people see. And so some artists read the whole book all the way through in order to fulfill their sense of duty to that project, and others are often given just a paragraph or 2 of character description and be like, create something. So it's really wild. But Hugh, we're going to get into the Wool adaptation. Scott from the book Invasion, he imagined Bernard from Wool rather than a Tim Robbins. He envisioned him as Wayne Knight, Newman from Seinfeld.
Same. I always thought like short, bald, like someone in IT would just be a little paunchy.
Yeah.
And got this guy who's like 6'8". And
I was gonna say he's really tall, right?
He's so tall. He's so imposing.
Wow.
I think this is an experience we've all had as fans of material that get adapted. And someone's mentioned this already, that you have a certain way of seeing them in your mind, and then you have a rejection of the casting, and then after a while you can't see them any other way, and that if it's done well, like they eventually in your mind, if you read the book again, they become that actor. So I've been more just excited that we've gotten people that I'm a fan of their work as actors, and I trust them to become these characters and learn to let go. I think it was Jen who said, if the check clears, whatever. I think you have a much higher, I've talked about this a lot elsewhere, but you have a greater chance of your things being adapted if you don't cling too hard to the unimportant parts of your story and just worry about the important parts, the DNA of it. Because the people who are adapting these things are looking for projects that they can bring their own creativity into and not deal with someone who's like objecting to every little thing. So I think it's a skill to be detached as you're adapting your works.
What has it been like for you to be on set and to be in the writer's room as well?
It's incredible. Actually, my call right after this is like jumping in on the writing room for season 2 of Wool. So like we're just in that process of making sure we tell the story in a way that fits the frame, the new medium. The number one question I got, like being on set, is everyone's like, "Does it look like you imagined?" Like, and they really feel like a duty, I think, to me to like, because through me, all the fans and the readers, for it to look like I expected. And I'm like, this looks so much better than anything I'm capable of imagining. Someone else pointed that out. Like, I don't know anything about fabrics. I don't know anything about hairstyle. I don't know anything about wardrobe. So I leave a lot of blanks for the reader to fill in. And there's entire teams of people who there's one office full of fabrics, and it's just someone there going through fabrics all day to make sure that this upholstery looks right and this person's. So like, how with my limited brain and imagination, I'm supposed to fill in all those blanks instead of a team of 200 people filling it in for me? Like, of course,
Exactly.
it looks so much better than anything I imagined.
And beyond that, it's not just 200 people; it's 200 specialists.
Yeah, they're the
Each
best
have
at
their
what
own
they do.
niche.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just so grateful to those people. They're like worried that I'm happy, and I'm like, you have no idea how happy you're making me. Like, I am borrowing all of your expertise to make this world like come alive in a way that I couldn't do it by myself.
Yeah, and I remember last time we spoke, you mentioned, I don't really care what happens. I can't put any expectations upon myself. I'm paraphrasing here, but basically, you won't believe it's real until you actually see it on your screen. I think it's on Apple TV, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Once it's there on Apple TV and you could watch it, it's not real until it gets to that point.
I'll modify that a little bit because I've been watching dailies. I have a program where even though they're filming in London and I'm here in New York, I can see what they shot the day before every day. And even the dailies don't make it feel real. But then over the holidays, the director, Morton, put together what they call a sizzle reel, where they actually do edits and do sound effects and it's like a trailer that you would expect to see to promote it, but it's like 8 minutes long, and like tears streaming down my face, not because it's like my stuff adapted, but because the emotional content of what he put together was so good. And that's when I was like, okay, even if somehow this whole thing got canceled right now, we could like put the sizzle reel on YouTube and it would satisfy a lot of people.
Yeah.
It made it feel real for the first time for me.
Amazing. And Jenny, for you, how does all this relate to your experiences in terms of screenwriting and then seeing how your work is translated to the cinematic lens?
Yeah, I think one of the big things for me in transitioning from, filmmaking to novel writing is the collaborative, which, he was talking about a lot. Filmmaking is 100% collaborative process. Even indie filmmaking, there might be fewer people on set, but it's still, everybody has their specialization. Everyone has a very specific job, and you're really, the DP and the director and the wardrobe person and the production designer all have to work together to create a single thing that is going to come out. And then you go to novel writing and you're sitting in your house alone for 2 months and no one else is involved until, you get an agent or you get an editor. But even then it's only, the three of us that are really involved. And my agent actually doesn't even really, she's not an editorial agent. So I just kind of send stuff straight to my editor. So it's kind of just me and her are making a book, and it's honestly very weird to me. Like I did have beta readers and critique partners and stuff that read as well, and I really relied on that so that's definitely something I'd recommend for any newer writers out there, is just get feedback, get other people's eyes on it, find the right people. Some people aren't going to be the right people to give you feedback, for sure. It can be difficult, but once you find your people, just making it a collaborative process again really helped energize me about it, and make me feel like I'm not just sitting making something in a void that no one was ever going to see. And then thinking about if it were to go the other way again and then become a collaborative process, I think that's where I kind of am able to kind of wash my hands of it, because I am used to, I wrote the thing, but you gave me the money and now you're going to make the thing, and that's fine. And I know, it sounds like, Hugh, you actually have a lot of feedback and a lot of say in things, but I know that other writers, they don't get anything, and they don't get listened to, and they don't get asked things or get to see things or anything. So I think it just kind of depends on the situation you end up in. I would be kind of fine with either situation because, I don't know. I don't want to like stress myself out about something I really just can't have any control over. So
yeah,
I feel like
it's funny you say that. I'm having both experiences right now because Wool I've been very involved in and been in the room and been on set. And then I was in LA for a completely different reason in December and emailed this guy who's show running another Beacon 23 that's being done for AMC. And I was like, we should get together and have lunch. He was like, yeah, I've got a lot of stuff to show you. And I show up there and he's showing me like all of the art and like it's so far along. They've got 10 episodes written. And I'm like, this is you guys have been doing a lot of work. He was like, yeah, we're filming in March. And I'm like, what? Like it's actually getting made? I had no idea. He's been working on this for like 3 years on his own, and it's his baby now.
Wow.
And if I don't email or ask somebody what's going on, they don't even think to tell me. So it's kind of fun to experience both because I'll tell you, one's a lot less stressful than the other. I thought it was cool to show up and like, oh, you guys, this is incredible. You're doing a lot of amazing stuff here. Glad you don't need me for any of it.
That's crazy. Well, Bender from FanFi Addict. Hey, buddy, how are you? He asked a question that's actually, I think it's kind of a fun hypothetical. We'll jump to Gareth first, but if any of you had a chance to adapt one of your books or a series, how would you approach that? Jenny's talked about her approach and just like, let it be and let it breathe. How would you approach it? And then what changes would you consider as, a potential improvement on what you've created?
Oof.
It's a heavy question.
I'm honestly not sure. My mind just keeps going to more Tolkien's letters, where he, with the first adaptation of Lord of the Rings back in like the 60s, the very last one, where his comment to his editor was art or cash. Basically, either we get it bang on right the way I've imagined it, or you pay me lots of money. Which certainly is a solid starting point. No, I mean, the other thing that you find is Arcane on Netflix was a fantastic adaptation of the
Legal Legends.
Legal Legends.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And that would sort of open up my eyes to like what animation could do. Was that like just very, very nicely? But I don't know. I mean, if someone wants to adapt one of my books, then I will happily do whatever they wish.
Would you want something like the Black Iron Legacy to be adapted into an animation? Do you think that would be a cool?
Yes.
However you want to adapt it.
Exactly.
Patty, what about you? If someone approached you about adapting Forging a Nightmare, how would you approach it, and if they had to make any changes?
I'm sort of like with Jen. Writing was such a private thing for me until my first novel, when I shared it with my kids and whatnot. So I guess I don't look for that kind of thing. I just want to write the next book and have fun. But I would really love to see Forging a Nightmare be an anime.
Yeah.
Live action, I just think would be too difficult because of the training of the horse and the care of the horse. Though, if they ever did that, part of the contract would have to be I get to ride the horse.
And the flaming CGI mane of the horse.
That's right. Or take the horse home with my other critters. I would love to see an anime style, not just animated. I would love to see the Japanese anime style of Forging a Nightmare. That would be so cool.
Yeah, I'm just imagining like I know tonally they're very different, but something like Cowboy Bebop or Samurai Champloo in terms of that, like those are very cinematic animes, but they're also a little bit westernized. And I think that would be really cool to see Forging a Nightmare come up in that kind of style. And also those have, like Samurai Champloo has a galloping pace, so it's right up your alley.
Oh my gosh, I love that. That's what I do in anime. I know I like you for a reason.
I know. And Jen, you mentioned earlier, like finding your people. Very happy I found Patty. We're in a writers group together, so
nice.
It's really nice to have people around you that can share your work and bounce your ideas off of. And and just talk about this kind of stuff, because writing is a very insulated thing. Whereas cinema is so collaborative, as Hugh and Jenny have mentioned.
I have changed my writing style in my creative writing class, where I just had the kids writing, but I decided to drop back and have them do a feedback portion where they would read 10 minutes of something and then get feedback from the class. And initially the kids are really timid and afraid of that. But when they realize that the environment is safe and that we're a community of writers together, they love it. So our writing got cut down to about a third, but they loved the experience. And I could have any one of my kids sit in on an adult group and probably outshine the adults.
Because adults are sensitive and they don't know how to deal with critique. Brian, I'll toss the same question to you. If one of your books were to be adapted, one of your series, how would you approach that? What would you think? If they were to ask you for some glaring changes, like they did for Game of Thrones, how would you feel?
Oh, I mean, I think for me, practically my books would be so difficult to adapt because the premise is that it's a world where dragons are everywhere. They're like just kind of normal animals. They're like really dangerous, but there's like thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So, Game of Thrones with its huge budget had like, noticeable gaps without dragons because the CGI was so expensive. So honestly, if someone came to adapt it with the amount of cash it would take to have that many dragons, I'd be like, do whatever you want. Like,
how much did Game of Thrones spend on the dragons for their CGI budget? It was just like,
it was a lot. Yeah, I think it was a running joke. Like they would write the dragons out because there just wasn't enough time or money or resources. So yeah, if I never thought that my books would get published. So I wasn't even thinking about that. But I might have toned down the number of dragons required for the story to work if I'd had an eye for that, but I didn't. So yeah, I think I would just be ecstatic enough to probably have no notes, regardless of what they wanted to do.
Well, your books it's another series that would work well animated or anime or something along those lines. I remember there's this Netflix show, I think it's called The Dragon Prince. It's pretty YA. I think it's YA. Aimed at sort of 13 to 18 kind of thing, but adults can still watch it because who gives a shit. That one didn't necessarily have an animation style that I liked, but in terms of the content that was there and the sort of maturity that they were presenting in that series, it was really cool. And I think for a series like yours with the amount of dragons that are there, it's like just animate everything, baby. However many dragons you want.
Yeah, it's funny. I have steered away from like reading and watching stuff with dragons, and not for any other reason than if I see an idea, I'd be like, well, I should have thought of that. That was so much better. I just like the envy would be too strong. So I wanted to watch that, but I haven't seen it yet. Maybe now. I mean, it's my last book came out in August, so there's some space now. I'll getting back into consuming some dragon stuff and try it out.
Cool. Well, I wanted to sort of wrap up this panel. We've been talking a lot about cinematic storytelling, film, and how it ties into books, but I just kind of want to throw out to you guys, do you feel like films, television, and books in the terms of a cinematic lens or a cinematic angle, are we just talking in generalizations, or like, I feel like there's so much room for variety in terms of how storytelling is presented. So do these generalizations have to be so confining, or what kind of room is there for writers out there? Whoever wants to go.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's kind of genre based in my head, right? Like we are sci-fi fantasy writers, and that kind of lends itself towards the sort of cinematic storytelling, whereas other genres and literary fiction and things don't necessarily need to adhere to their audiences, but new audiences, attention spans, it's proven, have shortened to ridiculously small numbers. So more of those, novellas are becoming much bigger. And I personally have been loving reading novellas because I just don't have time to read full novels. And I feel like I've accomplished something and I can check it off on my list, So I feel like it's kind of genre based and just, thinking about, what publishers are going to want, because unfortunately, if you want to sell your books traditionally, publish your books, you kind of got to think about what publishers want, what editors want, and what therefore what readers want, which, you know, there's a whole nother panel you could talk about as far as, you know, who dictates that. You know, publishers give the readers what they give them. So are the readers really the ones deciding? Probably not. But yeah, so I think for me, it's a genre-based thing more than anything. But, you know, you write the story that, you know, you want to write, and that, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, the self-published and indie publishing markets are throwing a big old wrench in the trad pub world. And I think that creates even more breadth for what people can consume, what they can choose, and how they can sort of find their niche. Yeah. Does anyone else want to get in on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you're saying about, you know, different formats, and for sure retracting attention spans. My attention span to read a book has definitely gotten worse as time has gone on. But I was listening to Geek's Guide to the Galaxy podcast. They were reviewing the latest Matrix movie.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the panelists was a teacher, actually. So I'm actually curious, Patricia, if you've heard this before, but what she was saying was her students hadn't watched the original Matrix, and like never have I felt 100 years old and to learn that like the cool kids these days like aren't watching the Matrix. But what she said was they'd all watched the Animatrix, you know, which is this kind of like you know, short anthology type thing. And it was just like, I'm like, I can't believe I'm old enough, or like that movies are dying. They're like, movies just aren't that important to my students, and I had to like order them to watch the original Matrix. And yeah, I just think that attention spans are getting smaller. I don't think that means that like, you know, books are dead or anything like that, but the need to be able to have like a short attention span and still read a story might be getting greater. I really don't know. I don't spend a huge amount of time thinking about that kind of thing, but I thought that was very, very interesting. It made me feel very old, despite having like my first catastrophic lower back injury. Hearing that people haven't seen The Matrix, that kids these days haven't watched The Matrix, made me feel quite a bit older than that. So I guess
it just makes me sad, because I imagine it's like, oh, The Matrix is now in the same canon as like George Orwell's 1984 in terms of this is the classic that you have to consume. You have to read.
I know, like, oh, quiet old man. I'm like, oh God, I didn't think it would happen to me, but it did.
I wonder if it's not attention span as much as it is impatience with boring story, because at the same time people are binge watching like 5 seasons of a TV show,
Right.
and we say like everyone has the attention span of like a tweet, but then people will I've seen these Twitter threads go viral that are like 50 tweets long that take you 20 minutes to read.
Right.
So I think there's so much good content out there now that people don't have the patience for boring content. You're talking about all these different formats of entertainment, which really got me fired up and excited is that you're seeing storytelling blossom in formats you used to take it for granted. So even TV, it was just like something to sell soap during the breaks, but it was like you watched it because it was 4 channels. You watched something that was on, and now it's like some of the absolute best storytelling art known to man in that format. Video games used to just be shooting things and reaction and reflexes, and now my girlfriend does not like watching video games, but I was playing The Last of Us Part 2, and she would see some of what was going on. She would sit down and be like, watch for 2 hours. Like, what's going to happen with that person? Like the storytelling, they're hiring great writers to work on different mediums now. So as someone who loves to be entertained, I love that the bar is being raised so high, and you're finding, and also as someone who loves for storytellers to make a living and earn an income, there are more and more opportunities out there now, because I get what you're saying about like our attention spans are great. I think you're right. We just have a short attention span for things that are boring. And that's upping everyone's game and expectations. And for the consumer, it's raising the bar on the stuff that I get to sit down and entertain myself with.
Yeah, and then on top of that, the idea of what is entertaining, what is worthy of grabbing someone's attention and keeping that attention has changed. Speaking of expectations, Charles Dickens at his time was just an all-consuming entertainment that people wanted to pick it up and keep reading and consume that. But today someone reads Great Expectations and they're just like, oh God, what a fucking slog. It's like, how many pages is this book? So the expectation has changed just based on what we've become accustomed to across the board, whether it's films, TV, video games, podcasts, books, novellas, short stories, what have you. There's just so much out there that people can be extra picky with their attention based on what bores them, and they're just going to step away and find something else.
Yeah.
Patricia, Gareth, do you want to get in on this before we close out?
Brian, just going with what you said, I sort of feel the way you do, that there's a really short attention span, and time itself is just this precious thing that we just don't seem to have enough of. And what most kids are gratifying themselves on, because it's instant, is TikTok and Instagram. And they're quick and they're dirty. And I also need intervention probably, because you sit and watch.
Slutty dopamine.
I'm learning all kinds of terms that I probably just don't want to know. But I think there's a quality that children and even some adults have accepted where the quality just isn't there. And as writers, I think we see it and we know it. We just don't want to admit it, that the quality just is not as good as it used to be. And it's not a boredom thing. It's I have to work too hard.
Right.
I have to work hard to fill in the gaps that the author left or that the director left. And I don't want to when I can go watch TikTok.
Oh, my poor mind has to put in effort. No. Gareth, do you want to get in a last word?
Well, we're at a very weird time in terms of culture, because suddenly we have access to everything. Like your book isn't competing against what's on the shelves right now. It's also competing against suddenly every book in history is available pretty much through Kindle or whatever. So with streaming, it's not as you said, there are 4 channels. Now you have not only what's currently on the various streaming networks, the new things, but also the entire back catalogs of most of human creativity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a wonder. I judge all, given there's just so much stuff out there to watch and absorb.
Whatever your fancy, it's out there.
Yeah, indeed.
All right. Exactly. We'll close out there and just thank you all so much. If you could each let viewers know where they can find you on social media, if you want to pimp a book or two. Hugh, if you can let us know. I don't know if the release date for Wool, the adaptation, is public.
No, I think we're shooting through May, so it's going to be a little while. But the book is better. The book is always better.
Cool. Yeah, exactly. Go give money straight to Hugh. And where can people find you?
Hugh Howey everything. I think there's only one other Hugh Howey, and he's younger than me, so I got all the stuff before you did.
Yeah, you got it. Poor guy. And Brian, what about you? If you want to let viewers know about your books, and then let them know where you can find you.
Yeah, so here's book 1 of the Dragon and Terror trilogy. Or the UK cover's different, so I get to have 2 covers and look more prolific than I am. So that's the first book in the trilogy, and I'm on Twitter a lot and not active as much on the other channels, but I'm on them. And then my website's a great place to reach out to me too.
Awesome. And David Walters is asking where your blanket is, if you want to get that.
Oh my God, we're running out of time, David. This is getting ridiculous. My sister-in-law gave this to me when the book got published.
Let's see.
A really big blanket.
Nice. It's upside down, Brian.
No, it's upside down. Well, you get the picture. It's actually incredibly warm. It's incredibly warm and cozy, and it was a lovely gift from my sister-in-law Amanda. So Amanda,
of course it is. You got to wrap yourself in your own book cover.
Exactly. It's you wrap yourself in the vanity and the narcissism, and that's how things happen. So
just a good ego blanket. And Patty, where can people find you? Let them know about Forging a Nightmare as well.
I can be found on Twitter at Tristan, Treistan. I also can be found at my website, bybirthright.com. And this is Forging a Nightmare. Going this way. And again, urban fantasy at a galloping pace. If you love horses, you will love the book.
It's like 500 pages or so, and you'll just burn through it. So, and Jenny, what about you? Where can people find you?
Yeah. So again, debut is The Last Watch. The sequel's already out, and the third will be out in 2023. You can find me. I'm at JSDewes, DEWES on everything. I'm mostly on Instagram, but I'm available on everything, and my website's the same thing.
Cool. And you can show the exiled fleet too.
Oh, sure.
I don't care what David thinks.
Those covers are so cool, by the way. I love those
Ships
They're
covers.
exploding.
Yeah.
I don't know what the third's going to be like, but we'll see.
It's all good. More explosions.
Yep.
And Gareth, what about you? Where can people find you and tell them about your books?
Find me online at hanrahan.com or ranting on Twitter as Mytholder. I used to have copies of the books up behind me, but I'm moving house, so they're in a box somewhere. So there's the Gutter Prayer, the Shadow Saint, and the third book is The Broken God. And that's Black Iron Legacy.
Awesome. And those ones also have amazing covers by Richard Anderson.
They do indeed.
Super, super good. But thank you all so much for taking the time. I had a great chat and I learned a lot. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Fun.
All right.
Thanks,
See you
Adrian.
all soon.
Thanks, guys.